I would like to ask, what were you thinking? Because Alma Brea is almost, I mean, the picture's great. I mean, the picture on the front even, right? It shows the adventurers relaxing around a campfire. You know, they're not fighting anybody. They're not killing anybody. They're not looting anybody. They're gone camping. And so the question is, what were you thinking? Why are those dudes in there? Because they really stick out compared to how you handled everything else. And the book's very explicit on why they have these particular fantasy races presented in this way, playable in this way, and the kobolds just do not fit. So I don't know. Maybe it's a joke on the D&D cultural standard that kobolds are there for the killing, and who knows? And just says, well, that's how they're going to end up. That's what they get. I don't know. I can't even come up with a reasonable, justification. So that brings us finally, at long last, to this super interesting game, also from 2000, like the World Tree. And this one is created by Barbara Webb, with a writer named Heather Alice Watson. For whatever reason, just these three games that I've chosen for this topic have a very strong women's hand in their design and authorship. The Dan Fox's spouse was clearly heavily involved, through all the credits and some design aspects too. So I don't know what that means. But anyway, Apocrypha is this game. And I give thanks to Jonathan Tweet back in 2001 for pointing my attention toward it. At first glance, you're looking through it and you're going, what kind of splat booky, throw in the kitchen sink mess of, tropes am I looking at here? And why would I care if I get a +1 in this and a -1 in that by playing this dude versus that dude? And all we do is run around in this big city and play knockoff, movie script adventures. Wait, what? Well, that's not fair. There is an element of that when you play in sort of their kitchen sink city that is clearly exists only so that players can pick whichever of the races. And these, okay, first of all, they do have humans, but they're not designated as specifically as humans as in Alma Brea. They do what a number of games do, where they include one of the races with its own funny name that is its own. It's usually not neutral in terms of its attributes and stuff either. It's not the baseline. And, you look at it and you say, oh, okay, those are the humans. And so, that they do have one of those. But what's really important about this game is that each of the different races represents an incredibly deep take on culture, gender, body, identity, and religion. And it's really deep. I've played the game fairly carefully, and it's got a fairly big payoff at that level. And the language is revisited, or the topic is revisited in different language from section to section to section of the book. And each section provides a lens on the topic, and it's never contradictory. You get what, this race's deal is, and also about individual variations within it or concerns that they may have upon encountering the other races. And it's really not stereotypical. That there's not a list, for example, of, well, if you're a this is what you think of each of the others, which is very common in these games. I hesitate to go into too much detail. It's really overwhelming for this game, but they really do an amazing job. You want to do, gender identity, then you've got the bird people who adopt very, very strong gender identities that are kept. I mean, they're very overt, but their sexual gamete producing status is not visible and is known only to them and their most close intimates. And this is not considered like a secret that you're hiding. It's just considered private because your gender identity is, who you are. And it's very interestingly done. And then the way that might butt up against some of the other either very strongly gendered in a more physical sense races, or some of them that are very flexible, the ones that have hardly any body of their own and just sort of assume the bodies of the others. And so it's really interesting. Some of it is kind of essentialist, and some of it very definitely isn't. So where it's essentialist, it's not because the authors are viewing it essentially. They're just presenting that as one of the spins to throw up in the air and spin in the air with everything else going on. They recommend considering single race play as if the rulebook were, just about that one group. I find that extremely compelling. I've done that with one of the groups, the Lorath, which was just actually a remarkable experience. Really, really good to delve into. Instead of seeing how they strike sparks off the other viewpoints, you delve into its own internal conflicts and the way that lens turns familiar issues into their own shapes and controversies. And that's what I recommend. But maybe, a couple of sort of splitting the difference and doing some situation where you have one group and another. The obvious one would be to take the Kefale, who are the humans, and have them be explorers or colonists or something in some place where one of the other groups is native. And just treating that as the setting, never mind their kitchen sink, city. And the mechanics are just there to rock and roll. So this is a really interesting one because it takes everything wrong with the concept of race and turns it up to 11 in a non-ironic, very thoughtful, per variable way. Just goes it's a pretty fearless text, goes every single step of the distance that you can take to say, well, if that's the case, then what is it like and what can happen? And so you get the best of social science fiction. You take a human outlook that's dealing with issues of our day and are deep concern to us personally, and you dramatize them and turn them to the point of dramatically, striking caricature in a non-contemptuous way and say, now what? What do we got? What do we see when we look at ourselves this way? What do we see? And you're very familiar with it. This is something that Star Trek and other shows have attempted to do multiple times when they're not doing something else. And anyway, Apocrypha to me is probably one of the very few role-playing games that manage that, and the textual difference between it. You see, in the groups in Apocrypha, each group does even have its own god who is sort of kind of real and real enough for the characters to believe in fairly, non-irrationally. And so you would think that it's really similar to the World Tree in this regard, but it's not. It doesn't have that validating, openly supremacist content. And to be one of these groups is not to be validated in it as, as a special kind of being, but rather to say, and now here are my problems. Here is how these things that play out for me. And so it's taking otherness to the point where it is reflection and drama, without, to hopefully discover, that no, the otherness is not other. So I find it rather compelling. I've always liked Apocrypha for this quality. So the breakdown here, is pretty interesting. Grab this topic, if you will. This notion of we've got a diversity of things, whatever you want to call it, primes, whatever, a diversity of them, and whether and how the supremacy or specialness or that kind of distinction actually matters. I'm really interested in games that aren't using elf, dwarf, etc. in the familiar way. So if you're going to do that, a game that has those, then look for something like Halma Brea, which deliberately and explicitly subverts it. Science fiction games with a ton of these characters is useful. Beware, though, in most of them or many of them, you'll find the elf, the dwarf, and the halfling looking back at you. Anyway, find a game that you think addresses this issue of specialness and whether other is other, and whether there is an other, like the bad kind, in there. And let's see what we come up with.